Across cultures and mythologies, humans used to have all kinds of beliefs about divinities. But when we look at some of these myths, instead of what we were used to, the perfect image of an omnipotent, benevolent God, we are often met with some really controversial or imperfect beings. I've recently wrote this Substack article, and since I've been interested in mythology from a very young age, growing up reading Percy Jackson books, and I happen to also grow up religious and have a rising interest in philosophy, I was very interested in this subject of why this happens, why those ancient mythologies, instead of coming up with this perfect being that we nowadays consider a god, why did they come up with such strange stories? By the way, what you're seeing on the screen is my Substack article that I'll be using as a guide for this video. And first, to better understand mythological views of gods, we have to look at the god spectrum, or what exactly is a god. Because even though nowadays the most popular image of God is this omnipotent creator, throughout fiction, mythology, and even pop culture, God can mean many different things. In many cases, God can refer to a superhero from a modern movie. In other cases, God can refer to some kind of force of nature that has been personified into a god. And in some stories, you will find gods as some kinds of mysterious spirits that simply exist in a world but are not tied to those popular images of a god we have in mind. But since there exist so many depictions of what a god is, and the question is even widely discussed in theological discussions and philosophical discussions, even amongst members of the same religion, people can hold slightly different views on what exact characteristic their god holds. So instead of analyzing the whole spectrum, here is a short list of some popular types of gods we can find. First of all, and the one we are most familiar with, is the omnipotent creator. It encompasses all depictions of a god who created the universe, but can still be broken further into subtypes. Those subtypes can be whether the god is still involved in the world, or maybe he created it and exists outside of it and can't really interact with it. You can get really in-depth into this, but it's not a topic of this video. Then we have the force of nature, the well-known Poseidons and Zeuses of mythology. This category involves every god who holds some force of nature as part of their influence, or maybe their entire domain. Those are gods like the god of the sun, the god of storms, the god of oceans, pretty much anything that to ancient humans could have seemed terrifying or magnificent or very, very mysterious. Then the next type are concepts personified. Those are abstract concepts like death, justice, or balance. Anthropomorphized, they can express themselves and take action in the real world. And later on in this video, I will also explain why different cultures have often created personifications for the same concepts. Then we have the otherworldly gods. If you're familiar with H.P. Lovecraft or Cthulhu mythos, then you already know what I'm referring to. In short, those are cosmics or otherworldly beings that are beyond our comprehension. Since they're beyond our comprehension, there is not much to discuss, but these types of gods are often tied to horror, since just witnessing or interacting with them can bring us into madness. And the last point on the list are the spirits. They're often not even exactly considered gods, but since in some stories and depictions they are, I thought it would be fitting to include them. The spirits are usually gods that are in some ways parts of nature. You will often find them being protectors of nature, like Leshi, the protector of the forest, or personifications of some places, like river spirits, tree spirits, and so on. But it's also a broad category where I often find included the types of gods that can't easily fit into any of the other categories, those mysterious beings that happen to be called gods. If you want to dive more in depth into this topic of categories of gods, Overly Sarcastic Productions have a great video on this topic. It's from their Trope Talks series, and it heavily inspired this section of this video. Now let's finally get into the core topic of this video, which are flawed gods of early mythologies. And what I wanted to explore is how those people came up with these gods. What were their circumstances and what were the reasons that could have resulted in those glaring thoughts in their mythical beings. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine to hold similar beliefs to what they used to. Thanks to science, we have a really good understanding of our surroundings and how the world works. But if you would put yourself in the shoes of those ancient humans, then everything around you is a complete mystery, and there are plenty of places where your imagination can run wild. If you had no concept of what an earthquake is and suddenly you feel the whole world shaking, then it's no wonder you would think it's some kind of supernatural force doing that. And not only that, this supernatural force must probably be angry with you. And that's where we get to the first argument for why ancient gods look the way they do. Nature is temperamental. Powerful natural phenomena that inspired fear and awe were a magnet for belief. Since natural disasters, whether it were earthquakes, tsunamis, or maybe simply lightning, since they were so powerful and unexplainable to us, then it was easy to imagine that maybe there is some god doing that. Maybe there is some powerful figure responsible for all of it. And since those phenomena were temperamental and seemingly random, then the gods also must be temperamental. They must have some sort of reason for sending those disasters, and since they're killing everyone around you, then they're probably not all compassionate and merciful. Then we get to personifications, which I've mentioned earlier. I believe that the benefit in making those abstract concepts like death into a divine but anthropomorphized figure made it easier to grasp or come to terms with. Giving a concept a tangible form made you able to, in a way, interact with it. If you imagine a certain concept as a human-like being, then you can, at least in your imagination, talk to it, communicate with it, and empathize with it. And it also becomes more familiar and maybe a bit less scary. But of course, through giving those concepts human feature in this way, you will also give them human faults. You can't really make those concepts similar to humans without giving them at least some human emotions and, as a result, human flaws. Then I would like to jump to a very practical reason, the power of drama and stories. Because when you think of Greek myths like Zeus constantly cheating on Hera, or other gods causing disasters, kidnapping people, chasing after innocent mortals, and the plenty other horrible things that they've done in myths, then those actions seem like something straight from a soap opera. We should remember that at the end of the day, myths are a collection of stories. And this means that stories that are the most engaging, which also often means the most dramatic, are the ones that will end up being shared the furthest. And that also gives them the biggest chance to survive to this day. Of course, not all stories were purely for entertainment. In many cases, they were about sharing knowledge, often in the form of cautionary tales. And in those cases, those stories might not necessarily represent the exact beliefs of those people, but were more of a practical tool for sharing knowledge and warning people and sharing some common values. Since storytelling greatly improved remembering information in an age where you couldn't just write it all down and print it as a book and share it with the whole village. And the last argument, which should seem obvious when you think about it, is politics and war. There were many scenarios in history where religion was used for political goals, and the same goes for myth. Whether it's claiming a divine lineage, creating divine-inspired rules to follow, or rewriting and vilifying deities when taking over competing religions. There are many scenarios where a certain religion takes over another country and they have to get rid of the other's religion, so they do it through creating new stories or changing the narrative of the other religion, slowly introducing your beliefs into theirs, often blending it in a way that is somewhat subtle. In some texts about Nordic philosophy, I believe there is this higher dimension above Asgard where supposedly like the final true god lives. And it's very likely that it's a Christian addition to those Nordic stories, since of course this highest single god is probably supposed to point towards the Christian god. But what happened to all of those beliefs when science took over? Because once we understood what causes lightning, tsunamis, and earthquakes, there was no need for gods to explain those concepts. It would even seem ridiculous to keep believing in Poseidon or Zeus. And the same goes for sickness, the sun, and stars, as well as other mysteries of the world. Seemingly, the only unexplained phenomena are the creation of the universe, our consciousness, morality, and what happens after death. And it just so happens that those are the areas where modern religious discourse is focused at. This, I believe, is also the main reason for why two of the most popular religions in the world each worship a single perfect omnipotent creator. Having explained many other phenomena in the world, faith naturally started pointing towards this morality. People started questioning more and more fundamental concepts. But this also created another interesting problem. That wasn't an issue for ancient gods. Since ancient gods varied a lot and were mostly representations of some concepts or forces of nature, they didn't have to stick to strict moral values. But since now the word God is tied to this perfect omnipotent being, then you encounter what is called the problem of evil. If God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, then why does evil and suffering exist? And it's a very famous argument in philosophical discussions. There exists a whole field of theodicy trying to explain this one problem of evil. And if you ever decide to listen to some theological or philosophical discussions on YouTube, then you will probably encounter the mention of the problem of evil very, very often. But personally, I will leave that popular point of debate for others to discuss. Thanks for listening, and if you want to review this article yourself, you can find the link in the description. See you guys next time.